Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, in the headlines today, you can go over to the Washington Times. UK top spy warns Putin won't stop at Ukrainian border if he wins the war. Now, this is the type of just completely asinine rhetoric that is feeding the uninformed urbanites here in the ununited states of America. And very unfortunate. If you go actually into the body of the article is as follows. Britain's spy chief says a Russian victory in Ukraine would endanger Western security because President Vladimir Putin wouldn't stop when his forces reached the border of neighboring countries such as Poland, Romania, and Hungary. Again, completely asinine, completely far-fetched. The Russians, as we speak right now, if, hypothetically speaking, the Ukrainian military crumbles, collapses, and then we find Russian forces rapidly moving west, eventually occupying Kiev, and then continuing to move hundreds of miles west and seizing the western city of Lviv. Now, any military analysts worth their salt would understand that a Russian military move into Poland would be near impossible. It would take many years for the Russians to prepare for an all-out war against NATO in terms of moving towards Poland and then possibly into Germany. It's just utterly ridiculous. And it's something that is simply not going to happen. It's not. Sir Richard Moore, chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, better known as MI6, said the world is the most dangerous it has been in his 37-year intelligence career. I would agree with that. I would definitely agree with that. Our security, British, French, European, and transatlantic, would be jeopardized, he said Friday in a speech at the British Embassy in Paris to mark 120 years of the agreements that ended centuries of rivalries between France and Britain. The cost of supporting Ukraine is well known, but the cost of not doing so would be infinitely higher, Mr. Moore said. If Putin succeeds, China would weigh the implications. North Korea would be emboldened. Well, what is North Korea going to do? Come on. Look at the defense budgets between North Korea and South Korea. Look at the GDP. It would be suicide for the North Koreans to move upon South Korea. It's just not going to happen. He likes his cognac. The Rocket Man likes his cognac and Swiss cheese. And a war between North Korea and South Korea would remove his ability to garner Swiss cheese and cognac. Very difficult. In his view, Moscow's insatiable need for military weapons such as artillery and drones, along with fresh recruits it can send to the front lines, has made it into little more than a client state to Tehran, Beijing, and Pyongyang. I do not doubt the transactional consequences of that arrangement and the succor it brings to Russia, Mr. Moore said. Yeah. Unbelievably ridiculous. Off the charts crazy. Now, additionally, we have Volodymyr Zelensky says NATO offer for Ukrainian-controlled territory could end hot stage of war. So here we go. More irrational exuberance from Volodymyr Zelensky. So Volodymyr Zelensky believes that a rapid entry into NATO by the Ukraine and turning over territory to the Russians. The Russians already have significant amounts of territory. The Russians entered this conflict to prevent the Ukrainians, the borderlands, from joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The prevention of the Ukraine from joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is more important than securing current territory. And again, this is to feed the uninformed urbanite. The uninformed urbanite here in Western Europe, in the United States, sees the headline, hey, Volodymyr Zelensky is offering Ukrainian eastern-held territories that the Russians already control if Zelensky can simply join NATO and secure the remaining portions of the Ukraine under the protection of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Why would the Russians allow that? So what Zelensky is essentially saying is that the Russians can secure control over the territory that they currently have. I would assume that the Ukrainians would withdraw from the Kursk pocket, and then the remaining portions of the Ukraine would then join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We would, in all probability, see actual official NATO troops from France, the United Kingdom, officially, meaning actual NATO combat brigades, under the guise of a peacekeeping mission, enter the Ukraine. The Russians are not going to allow that. It's not going to happen. The reason the Russians are not going to allow that is NATO has proven itself not to be solely a defensive organization. And again, I hearken back to the war on Serbia, the military operation that killed Gaddafi. Again, these were NATO operations. Libya was no threat to Western Europe. It was not a threat to NATO. Serbia was not a threat to Western Europe. And yet, there was intervention. There was a military operation, an aggressive military operation by NATO against both Serbia to tear away territory from Serbia and hand it over to Albanian separatists, Muslim separatists in southwestern Serbia. Libya, for economic reasons, NATO and the United States decided to kill Gaddafi and plummet that nation state into perpetual civil war. Do some research. Where is the Libyan gold? Where is the Libyan gold? It's not in Libya. And then the expectation is for Russia to then accept NATO forces in what was an actual part of the former Soviet Union. It was an integral part of the Soviet Union. This was not like, the Ukraine was not like Georgia. It was not like the Baltic states. The Ukraine is different. The Ukraine is a red line that the Russians are perfectly happy on continuing a major conflict. And I think we've entered the point right now, the point of no return in terms of the Russian war. The Russians now see this ongoing conflict as a moment in history in which they must defeat the current regime that controls Kiev and drive out the last vestiges of NATO forces that are continuing to assist Ukrainian forces. I think this war has changed. I think early in the conflict, as I've talked about before, there may have been room for compromise. I think where we're at now, 3 years later, in terms of what has happened, the amounts of weapon systems, I think NATO has really shown its hand. And it's made it glaringly apparent to the Russians that they cannot accept a NATO-aligned Ukraine. And thus the war will continue. And as we speak, that war is continuing. Again, let's move over to the collapsing Donbas pocket. A multitude of envelopment operations are continuing. The Donbas pocket, the Kharkova pocket, is collapsing. Russian forces have made it to the city center of Kharkova. Again, let's look what has happened over the last few days. These offers by Volodymyr Zelensky are a sign of desperation, and the Russians know this. More envelopment operations. Novosilka. You're watching a general collapse of the Ukrainian front line. So why would the Russians, if they are on the verge of a military victory, why would they allow Ukraine to join NATO? They're not. It's not going to happen. The Russians will continue to prosecute the war until victory has been reached. Now, what are those war goals? What are those war aims? I think at this point, the Russians need Zelensky to flee to the west. Maybe Denis Davidov and Volodymyr Zelensky can become roommates. Maybe they can become pals. I don't know. But they're not going to stop the conflict. There's no way Ukraine is joining NATO. There's no way NATO is moving combat brigades into Ukraine unless it wants a direct war with Russia. And the Russians are preparing for this. We're seeing this on the ground. If it comes to the need for Russia to engage NATO in Ukraine, the Russians will do it. And they'll also probably prosecute a conflict against the Baltic states as well. They can do that. NATO is not in a position to engage the Russian Federation in the Baltic states. But for the Russians to invade Western Europe, invade Poland, invade Hungary, it's just not going to happen. It's nonsensical talk. Complete and utter nonsense. Baltic states and a direct engagement in the Ukraine, possibly leading to World War III, very probable at this point. The Russians right now are talking about resuming nuclear testing. The Russians have fired a new conventionally armed intermediate range intercontinental ballistic missile designed for conventional strikes against Ukrainian targets. So there you have it. As always, again, thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.